I watched Henderson's lanterns swing out over the ravine and hang there in the black, as if some unseen hand had seized his arm and held it. The flame burned steady, though the wind howled around us, and the night below answered with a low, wet clicking that was not any frog, nor bird, nor man. The horses shivered. Something pale moved just beyond the circle of light and did not blink. Men have asked me to set this down, to speak plain of what we found in those timber camps before the turn of the century. I do so now in my old age and would hear from any who know such nights. Give your thoughts, your own tales, and lend your name to this account by marking it and leaving your word beneath. To understand that lantern hanging over the ravine, I must return to the first days of November in the year 1898, when the company sent us into the high country above Clay County, Kentucky, to survey the new tracts for spruce and poplar. My name is Edward L. Carraway. At that time, I was employed as a surveyor and clerk for the Harlan and Boone lumber concern, based out of Lexington. The nation desired timber, the railroads demanded ties and trestles, and the hills of the southern Appalachians, so men said, held more trees than any axe could ever bring low. We left the railhead at Manchester on the 3rd of November, 4 men and 2 pack horses, with 10 days' provisions, canvas, kerosene lanterns, a Brunton compass, steel tape, my level and chain, and 3 rifles between us. There was myself, Henderson, the camp boss, a broad man from Pike County with a beard that hid a perpetual chew of tobacco. Young McBride, hardly 20, who had come from Ohio to seek work and adventure. And old Silas, our guide and muleteer, born in those hills and as lean as the laurel he walked through. The company had already a small logging camp established some miles up Greasy Creek, but we were bound beyond it to mark lines on a newly purchased tract that climbed into the higher ridges. Our orders were simple: establish the boundaries, note watercourses, and judge the quality of timber. I had been in those hills twice before and held no fear of them. They were steep and tangled, yes, and the November winds could knife through wool, but they were only woods, and woods were a thing a man might know. We followed the old trace along the creek, the horses' hooves sucking in the mud, the air smelling of leaf rot and coal smoke from scattered homesteads. Now and then, we passed a cabin where thin dogs barked and women watched from the doorway. Once an old man in a slat hat hailed Silas by name and asked where we were bound. When Silas told him the tract, the man spat and made a sign against ill luck. "Night runs different up yonder," he said. "Keep your fires high." Henderson laughed and tipped his hat. "We aim to keep them burning, old-timer. No haint ever took a man with a good blaze and a sober head." The old man did not smile. His eyes slid to the rifles, then to me, as if to weigh whether we were the sort who would heed a warning. I noted it, but only as a curiosity, and wrote in my pocketbook that the locals were superstitious regarding night travel in upper hollows. At the time, that seemed the whole of it. We reached the lower camp by dusk. It sat in a narrow flat by the creek, 3 bunkhouses of rough boards, a cook shack, and the skeleton of a skidway where logs would later be snaked down to the water. The men there were hard from work and whiskey, and they greeted Henderson with hoots and questions. A few had wives and children in town, a few had nowhere at all. They spoke of a black bear that had harried the garbage heap the week before, and of a tree that had fallen in still air. "Rot at the base," I said. "You must watch for that." "Rot nothing," one man answered. "Sound as a bell when we cut it. split clean, like something had gripped it in the middle and twisted. The others laughed at him, but not loudly. It was that sort of talk men will indulge at the edge of their courage, when the lamps are lit but the windows are dark outside. We slept that first night in the bunkhouse, the stove glowing red, the sound of the creek steady beyond the walls. I remember waking once, near midnight, to a silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. No creak, no wind, no snore from the men around me. The hair rose on my arms. I lay there counting my own breaths, wondering if I had gone deaf in my sleep, when a distant cry sounded far up the hollow. It was high and thin, like a woman's voice carried on the wind, but stretched too long, as if the lungs that made it did not tire as human lungs must. It rose and fell in a slow, wavering keen, and then broke into a series of soft clicks, like stones tapped together in a measured pattern. Someone near me muttered and turned over. The creak rushed again. A man coughed. The sounds of the world resumed, as if a curtain had been lifted. I told myself it had been a panther or some such thing, and that my fancy had filled the silence with more than was there. By morning, I had almost forgotten it. We left the next day for the upper tract. The lower camp foreman offered us 2 men to go along, but Henderson refused, saying 4 were enough and the company did not pay for idlers. So it was only the 4 of us when we turned off the main trace and began to climb. The land grew steeper, the laurel thicker. We followed an old game trail along a spur, then dropped into a dark hollow where the sun did not reach even at noon. The ground there was spongy with moss and old needles, and the air smelled of cold stone. I set my compass, took bearings, and marked trees with the company's blue paint. We spoke little, for the climb was hard. Near midday, we halted by a spring that bubbled from under a rock shelf. As we ate, McBride took from his coat a small tin with a photograph inside, creased and much handled. He caught me looking and smiled, shy as a boy. "My sister," he said, "back in Zanesville. She married a clerk this summer. Has a little shop of her own now. She says when I have a stake, I am to come home and set up honest." "What will you do with your stake?" I asked. He considered. "Buy a bit of land. Maybe a store, somewhere flat where a man can see his neighbor coming. I have had my fill of hollows." Henderson chuckled. "You have not seen a hollow until you see one in snow. Wait until January, boy." Silas smoked in silence, his eyes on the dark trees above us. After a time, he said, "These hills do not much care if a man has a sister or a stake or a name. They take what they please." McBride grinned, trying to dispel the weight of that remark. "You have lived here all your life, Silas. The hills have not taken you." "Not yet," Silas answered. He did not grin. That small exchange has stayed with me more than any other from those early days. It is one thing to remember a man's name, another to remember that he had a sister who waited for him and a photograph worn soft at the edges. We pushed on. Through the afternoon, I began to notice that the woods were strangely empty of sound. There were no woodpeckers knocking, no squirrels scolding from the branches. Once I saw a crow fly overhead, but it did not call. The only noise was our own passage, the creak of leather, the labored breath of the horses, the rasp of Silas's cough. I mentioned it to Henderson. He shrugged. "Cold snap coming. Beasts hole up when the weather turns." It was true that the air carried a bite, and clouds were massing over the western ridges. I accepted his explanation, though something in the quality of the silence troubled me. It was not the full hush of winter, which has its own softness, but a tight, listening stillness, as if the forest held its breath. We made camp that night on a narrow bench above a dry creek bed, perhaps 6 miles from the lower camp, and, by my reckoning, already within the disputed tract. We set a good fire of oak and laurel, slung a canvas lean-to, and boiled coffee in a blackened pot. The sky above the gap showed a strip of hard stars. After supper, McBride coaxed a tune from a mouth harp, and Henderson told of a fight he had seen in a coal camp, his voice rolling and sure. For a time, the camp was only a camp, and the woods were only woods. Later, as the fire settled, Silas spoke of the old stories. He did not do so, as men sometimes do, to frighten the young, but in a low, matter-of-fact tone, as if he were discussing the lay of the land. My grandfather said there were places up here where the dark comes down from the trees before the sun is gone, he said. Said, if you are caught in such a place, you must not answer when you are called, no matter whose voice you hear. Wolves, Henderson said, or Indians in his day. Men make tales to explain what they fear. Maybe so, Silas replied. But my grandfather lived to be old, and he did not go where the dark moved first. McBride asked, "What calls you, Silas?" Silas shrugged. Sometimes it is a woman crying. Sometimes it is your own name, spoken soft, right behind your ear. Sometimes it is nothing you can say, only a wanting, like thirst. The fire cracked. A log shifted, sending up a flurry of sparks. I remember the way McBride's face looked in that light, half in shadow, the photograph of his sister tucked back in his pocket. I remember telling myself that men in all wild countries had such tales, and that if I allowed them to take root in my mind, I would soon hear voices in every owl's cry. I slept, if not soundly, at least without dream. Sometime in the night, a wind came up, rattling the canvas and stirring the leaves. I woke to the smell of cold iron and the sense of something passing close by, just beyond the circle of our fire. I heard no step, no branch break, only the faintest series of soft clicks, as if 2 small stones were being tapped together in a deliberate rhythm. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. I raised myself on one elbow. The fire had burned down to coals, but there was enough light to see the horses, standing with heads low, their hides quivering. One of them blew through its nostrils, a sound of fear. I reached for the rifle that lay beside my bedroll. "Who is there?" I called. The clicking ceased at once. The wind went on in the trees. Henderson snored, oblivious. McBride muttered something in his sleep. I sat there for some time, the rifle across my knees, until the cold drove me to throw more wood on the fire. In the morning, I decided it had been a limb, knocking against another in the wind, and the pattern I had heard was only my mind seeking order where there was none. The next day, we worked our way along the ridge, marking trees and taking bearings. The sky stayed low and grey. By noon, a fine snow began to fall, barely more than frost in the air, but enough to dust the leaves and show the path of our boots. It was then we found the first tracks. They crossed our path at a shallow angle, coming down from the higher slope and vanishing into a laurel thicket below. At first glance, I took them for the prints of a barefoot man, for they were roughly the length of my own boot, but narrower in the heel, with long splayed toes that bit deep into the frozen leaf mold. "Some poor devil hunting without shoes," McBride said, though there was no conviction in his voice. Silas knelt and laid his hand beside one of the impressions. His fingers did not reach from heel to toe. "No man walks this high in November without boots," he said. "Not if he means to live." "Then it is a hoax," I said. "Some joker from the lower camp hoping to scare us. See, the stride is too long for a man of that height. He must be swinging his legs." I measured the distance from one print to the next. It was near 5 feet. To maintain such a stride over uneven ground would be difficult, even for a tall man. Yet the depth of the impressions did not vary. Whoever had passed here had done so with ease. "Bear?" Henderson suggested. I shook my head. "No claws, and the heel is wrong. Besides, a bear does not set its feet in line like this. They wander." The tracks were almost perfectly straight, as if their maker had walked with its eyes fixed on some distant point, untroubled by stone or root. I followed them a short distance into the laurel, but there the snow had not settled, and the ground was a confusion of old leaves. There was no sign of where the trail went. "Come away from there," Silas said. "We have work to do." I obeyed, though I did so with reluctance. I marked the location in my book, intending to mention it in my report as a curiosity of the hills, perhaps a sign of some unknown animal. At that time, I still believed that any mystery, given sufficient attention, must yield to reason. As the day wore on, the snow thickened. The woods took on a muffled quality, as if we moved through a world half-formed. We decided to make camp early, in a shallow saddle between 2 ridges, where a stand of spruce offered some shelter from the wind. That evening passed without incident. We ate beans and salt pork, shared a little whiskey, and spoke of ordinary things. Henderson told of a woman he had known in Hazard. McBride asked me about the cities I had seen. For a time, the strangeness of the tracks receded. We were 4 men around a fire, with the smell of smoke in our clothes and the comfort of company. It was the last fully easy night we had. On the 3rd day, the snow lay in earnest. The ground was patched in white, and our breath smoked before us. The silence of the woods deepened. Once, far off, we heard the report of an axe, and later the faint cry of a hawk, but otherwise there was only the sound of our own passage. We came upon the upper camp shortly after noon. It was smaller than the lower one, only 2 bunkhouses and a cook tent with a rough corral for horses. The place should have been alive with men and noise. Instead, it lay empty, the doors of the bunkhouses standing open, the fire pits cold. Henderson called out, his voice echoing among the trees. No one answered. We searched the camp. There were bedrolls on the bunks, some half-made, as if the men had risen in haste. Tin plates lay on a table in the cook tent, with the crusts of bread still upon them, now hard as stone. A kettle sat on the stove, its bottom blackened, its contents long boiled away. "There were 6 men here last week," Henderson said. "They had a full winter's contract. They would not have left without their tools." Yet the tools were there. Axes leaned against the wall, saws hung from pegs. A crate of new wedges stood unopened in the corner. In the corral, the gate hung on its hinge, swinging slightly in the wind. There were no horses. Silas walked a slow circle around the camp, his eyes on the ground. "No sign of a fight," he said, at last. "No blood, no prints, save your own from the last time you came, Henderson. And these." He pointed to the snow beyond the corral. There, faint but discernible, was a line of tracks like those we had seen the day before. Long, narrow impressions, toes splayed, heels deep. They came down from the slope, skirted the edge of the camp, and vanished into the trees. Henderson swore under his breath. Those damn fools. They saw a bear or some such and ran for it. Ran where? I asked. There is no sign of them going down trail. The snow would show it, and they did not take their gear. We stood there in the thin daylight, each man turning the matter over in his mind, seeking some ordinary explanation. Perhaps they had gone deeper into the track to scout and would return before nightfall. Perhaps a message had come from the company and they had been called away in haste. Yet there was no note, no sign of purposeful departure. We will stay the night, Henderson decided. In the morning, we will follow the trail down. If they have gone to the lower camp, we will find word there. If not, we will send a man to town. It was a sensible plan. We were tired from the climb, and the idea of walking back in failing light over uncertain ground did not appeal. We set about making a fire in the cook tent and brought in extra wood. The place felt less empty with the stove lit and the smell of coffee rising. That night, the wind died. The snow ceased. A pale moon rose over the ridge, casting a cold light through the gaps in the roof planks. We lay in the bunks that had belonged to the missing men, wrapped in their blankets, our own gear stowed beneath us. I woke to the sound of someone walking outside. The steps were slow and deliberate, circling the bunkhouse. The boards creaked under the weight, but not as they would have under a heavy man. There was a certain lightness to the tread, yet each footfall seemed to sink deep into the earth, as if the walker were very tall or its legs very long. I held my breath and listened. The steps came to a halt just beyond my bunk on the other side of the wall. There was a pause, and in that pause I felt a pressure, as if something stood very near considering. Then came the clicking. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap, tap. It was the same pattern I had heard that first night, but closer now, almost at my ear, though the wall lay between. The sound was not loud, but it carried a peculiar weight, as if it were more than sound, as if it were a statement. I heard Henderson shift in the bunk across from me. "Who is there?" he called. The clicking stopped at once. For a heartbeat, there was perfect silence. Then, from the far side of the camp, by the cook tent, came the unmistakable sound of a man's voice. "Ed," it called. "Ed, come here a moment." It was McBride's voice. I turned my head. In the dimness, I could see his outline in the bunk below mine, his shoulders hunched, his breath slow and even. The voice outside sounded again, exactly as before. "Ed, come here. I want to show you something." The hair rose along my neck. I swung my legs over the side of the bunk and dropped to the floor, my hand groping for the rifle. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Henderson was already sitting up. "Stay where you are," he said, low and sharp. "Ed," the voice repeated, "you must see this." It had the cadence of McBride's speech, the same slight Ohio lilt, but there was a hollowness to it, as if it was spoken in a high, empty room. It did not sound as if it came through the wall or through the door, but as if it was simply present in the air. Silas's voice came from the darkness at the far end of the room. "Do not answer," he said. "Do not go out." The steps resumed, moving away from the bunkhouse. We heard them cross the yard, then mount the steps of the cook tent. The door creaked. Something moved within. There was a soft rattle of tin, a scrape of wood. For several minutes we lay there, listening to the sounds of our camp being explored by something that was not meant to be there. Once there was a low, almost conversational murmur, as if two or more voices spoke together. But the words, if words they were, did not belong to any tongue I knew. At last, the steps came back across the yard, paused once more outside our wall, and then receded up the slope into the trees. The clickings sounded faintly, then not at all. No one slept again that night. In the grey of dawn, we went out to see what marks, if any, had been left. The snow in the yard was crisscrossed with prints, but they were not ours. The long, narrow tracks we had seen before now covered the ground in a loose spiral around the bunkhouse, with occasional divergences toward the cook tent and the corral. At the foot of the bunkhouse steps, just below the doorway, there were 3 prints, perfectly spaced, as if something had stood there for some time, balanced lightly on the balls of its feet. The impressions were deep, yet the snow around them was undisturbed, as if they had been set down from above rather than pressed in from a step. In the cook tent, several plates had been moved from one table to another. A ladle lay on the floor. The kettle had been turned on its side. "Raccoons," Henderson said, though he did not sound convinced. "They get into everything." "Raccoons do not walk like that," Silas answered, "nor do they call a man by name." We argued then, in low, tense voices, each man clinging to his own explanation as if it were a rope over a chasm. To admit ignorance was to admit the possibility that we were not alone in those woods, and not in any sense we understood. "Whatever it is," I said at last, "it has not harmed us. We will go down to the lower camp, learn what we can of these missing men, and then return with more hands. There is no profit in 4 men chasing shadows." Henderson agreed. McBride said nothing, but his face was pale. Silas watched the tree line with narrowed eyes. We packed our gear in haste and set out down the trail, leaving the upper camp as we had found it, save for the fresh prints in the snow. The horses were skittish, rolling their eyes at every shadow. Once McBride's mount balked and would not step over a certain patch of ground, though there was nothing there that I could see. We had to lead it around in a wide arc. It was near midday when the shock came that shattered what remained of my composure. We were descending a narrow spur, the trail dropping steeply on our left into a laurel-choked ravine. The snow had melted in patches, leaving the ground slick. I was in the lead, with Silas behind me, then McBride, then Henderson bringing up the rear. Without warning, the world went silent. One moment there was the soft clink of tack, the creak of leather, the faint rustle of wind in the branches. The next, all sound ceased. My own footfall made no noise. The horses' breathing vanished. It was as if a bell jar had been placed over us, cutting us off from the air. I stopped, one hand going to my ear. The motion felt slow, as if the air had thickened. "Do you hear that?" I meant to say, but my voice did not emerge. My lips moved, no sound came. I turned, heart pounding, and saw that the others were also frozen in place, their mouths open, their eyes wide. In that unnatural stillness, from somewhere far below in the ravine, came a single, clear note. It was not loud, but it carried with perfect clarity, as if it were sounded directly in the bones. It was like a flute or a bird, but stretched and thinned beyond any instrument I knew. It rose and fell in a slow, deliberate arc, and with it came a pressure in my chest, as if my heart were being held in a cold hand. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the note cut off. Sound rushed back. The clatter of a stone dislodged under McBride's boot, the startled whinny of a horse, the gasp that tore itself from my throat. "What in God's name was that?" Henderson cried. Silas had gone grey. "We are in its path," he said. "We must move." "Whose path?" I demanded. He shook his head. "I do not know its name. Only that when the woods go still like that, you must not stand where you are." We hurried then, slipping and sliding down the trail, not daring to look too long into the depths of the ravine. Once I thought I saw something pale moving among the laurel, keeping pace with us, but when I blinked, it was gone. By the time we reached the lower camp, the light was failing. The men there came out to meet us, their faces tight when they saw our state. "They never came down," the foreman said when we asked of the upper camp crew. "We thought maybe the snow had delayed them. We were about to send a man up to see." We told them, in careful terms, what we had found: the empty camp, the strange tracks, the voice in the night. I left out the part where it had spoken my name, in McBride's voice. That detail felt too intimate, too much like a mark laid upon me. The men listened, their eyes shifting to the dark woods beyond the camp. One spat into the fire. "I told them," he said. "Told them not to work that high ridge. Old ground, that is. Not for us." Another man crossed himself. "It is the night walkers," he muttered. "My grandmother spoke of them. They come where the trees are cut, where the ground is opened. They do not like the sound of iron." "Foolishness," Henderson snapped. But there was less heat in his voice than there might have been 2 days before. "We will send word to town. The sheriff can make a search. There is no need to fill men's heads with tales." That night, the camp kept its fires high. No one played music. No one told stories. The wind rose, bringing with it a smell like wet stone and old leaves. I lay awake in my bunk, listening to the creek. Several times I thought I heard, beneath the rush of water, that soft clicking, like stones tapped together in a patient rhythm. Each time I told myself it was only the tumble of pebbles in the current. In the morning, Henderson and I rode down to Manchester with the foreman to make our report. The sheriff, a stout man with a red face, heard us out with a furrowed brow. "Men go missing in these hills," he said at last. "Fall, break a leg, freeze, run off, get themselves shot in some quarrel. As for tracks and voices, you have been too long without company. The mind plays tricks. 6 men do not all fall and break their legs at once," I said. "Nor do they leave their camp as if they had stepped out for a moment and never returned." He spread his hands. "I will send a posse to look, but I cannot put in my report that spirits called them away." In the company office, Mr. Boone himself listened to our account, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I spoke of the tracks, he frowned. "Some new species of bear, perhaps," he said. "We will mention it in our notes. As for the men, the sheriff will do his duty. In the meantime, we cannot leave that timber standing. There is too much money in it." "You mean to send others up there?" I asked. He looked at me as if I was slow. "Of course. With more men, and perhaps a preacher, fear spreads quicker than fire in a camp. It must be quenched." I wrote my official report that afternoon. In it, I described the disappearance of the upper camp crew, the condition of their quarters, the absence of signs of struggle. I mentioned the unusual tracks, suggesting they might belong to a large, unknown mammal, and recommended further study. Of the silence that fell like a glass dome, of the flute note in the ravine, of the voice that had spoken my name, I wrote nothing. In my private journal that night, I set down every detail I could recall, my hand trembling on the page. I did not then think that I would ever show those pages to another soul. The posse went up. 2 days later, 12 men with rifles and dogs. They found no bodies, no sign of struggle, no tracks beyond those already blurred by new snow. The missing men were listed as lost, presumed dead. Their families received what small compensation the company allotted. Work resumed in the lower camp. New men were hired for the upper tract. Henderson was ordered to lead them. He refused. "I will not take men into a place where the dark walks before its time," he told me when we met in the street outside the office. "Let them call me coward if they please. I have seen enough." He left for a logging job in Tennessee the next week. I never saw him again. As for me, I was kept on in the office for a time, then sent to survey tracts in other counties. I did my work, filed my reports, and tried to put the events of that November out of my mind. Yet they did not go. Years passed. The century turned. The railroads cut deeper into the hills. Towns grew where there had been only clearings. Men spoke of progress, of bringing light and order to the wilderness. The old tales were laughed at in company offices and on courthouse steps. Still, there were nights when I woke with the taste of cold iron in my mouth, my heart racing, certain that if I opened my eyes, I would see, just beyond the foot of my bed, a pair of long, narrow prints in the floorboards, damp with melted snow. Once, in the winter of 1907, I was in a hotel in Charleston on company business. The room was warm, the gaslight steady. Outside, the streetcars clanged and men called to one another. I lay in the narrow bed and listened to the civilized noises of a growing city. Then, without warning, all sound dropped away. The clatter of wheels, the voices, even the faint hiss of the gas mantle, all ceased. I lay there, rigid, my hand clutching the coverlet as a familiar pressure settled over my chest. From somewhere beyond the thin wall in the room next to mine, or the one beyond that, came a soft, deliberate clicking. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. I held my breath. The air felt thick, resistant. After a long moment, the clicking ceased. Sound returned. A carriage rattled past. A man laughed in the street. I heard someone in the next room cough. The next morning, I asked the clerk if there had been any disturbance in the night. He looked at me blankly. "None that I heard, sir." It was then I began to wonder whether the thing we had encountered in those hills was bound to that place, or whether, having once noticed us, it could reach across distance, following some thread laid down in the dark. In 1912, I received a letter from McBride. I had not heard from him in many years. He had left the lumber trade after that winter and gone home to Ohio, where, as he wrote, he had indeed opened a small shop with his sister's husband. His letter was short, his script shaky. "Do you remember," he wrote, "that night in the upper camp when something spoke in my voice? I have heard it twice since, once in the barn, once on the road behind our house. Each time it called my name, the way I called yours. Each time there was that same stillness. I did not answer. I do not know what would happen if I did. Sometimes I think we left something of ourselves up there, or perhaps we brought something down. I have not told my sister. She would only fear for my mind. I tell you because you were there. If you have heard it too, write and say so, that I may know I am not alone in this." I wrote back at once, telling him of the hotel, of the clicking, of my own uneasy nights. I tried to put the matter in terms that would not inflame his fear, speaking of shared hallucinations, of the way trauma can echo in the mind. I received no reply. 2 years later, I learned from a mutual acquaintance that McBride had been found dead in a creek near his home, his body unmarked, his face turned toward the bank as if he had been listening to something there. The coroner wrote, "Heart failure." His sister, I was told, kept his photograph on the mantel. I visited the old tract only once more in the autumn of 1920. The company had long since cut most of the timber there, and a new growth of saplings had begun to rise among the stumps. The lower camp was gone, replaced by a cluster of small houses for miners. The upper campsite was marked only by a few rotting boards and a rusted stove. I climbed to the saddle where we had once camped, my breath coming harder than it had in my youth. The air was thin and clear. No snow lay yet on the ground, but the leaves were down, and the woods held that expectant stillness that comes before winter. I stood there on that narrow bench above the dry creek bed and listened. For a long time there was only the distant cry of a crow, the whisper of wind in the bare branches. Then, very faintly, from somewhere I could not place, came a sound like a single drop of water falling into a deep well. Tap. It might have been a twig, a stone, anything. Yet as I turned to go, the hair on my arms lifted, as it had all those years before, and I felt, for a moment, as if something watched from just beyond the edge of sight, patient and curious. Now, in my old age, I sit at a window that looks out over a city street, the noise of automobiles and voices rising and falling like the tide. The world has changed beyond what any of us who went into those hills in 1898 could have imagined. Men speak of wireless signals, of machines that fly. They speak less of what walks in the dark. In the official records of the Harlan and Boone lumber concern, the incident of that November is a brief entry. 6 men lost in storm, camps temporarily disrupted, work resumed with no further incident. My own report, with its cautious mention of unusual tracks, lies yellowing in some file unread. My private journal sits on the table beside me. Its pages are filled with the words I have written here, and more besides, sketches of the tracks, notes on the woods, pattern of the clicking, references to old tales I have since sought out in books, and from the mouths of those who still remember the stories their grandfathers told. I have read of the night walkers of the Cherokee, of the strange lights seen in certain hollows, of voices that call men into the woods and do not return them. I have spoken with a preacher who served in those counties and who told me, reluctantly, of parishioners who heard their own names spoken in empty rooms. I have tried, in my way, to fit these fragments into some frame that will hold them. But there is no frame that does not leave great gaps. If I am honest, I must admit that I do not know what moved around our camp that winter, what left those long, careful prints in the snow, what stood outside our wall and spoke in the voices of men it had listened to. I do not know if it meant us harm or only study. I do not know whether it took those 6 men or whether they fled from it and were lost by their own fear. What I know is the weight of the silence when it came down around us on that narrow trail. The pressure in my chest at the sound of that single, drawn-out note from the ravine. The way my own name sounded when something else tried it on its tongue. Sometimes in the small hours, when the city is as quiet as a city can be, I wake with the sense that the air around me has thickened. The ticking of the clock on the mantel falters, then falls still. The street outside goes mute. In that pause, I hear it, faint as if far away, yet clear as ever. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. The sound of something patient, marking time in the dark, as it has done since long before my people came to those hills with their axes and their iron. The sound of a presence that does not hurry, that is not troubled by years, that waits for men to stray once more into the places where the night comes down early from the trees. I lie there, old bones stiff under the quilt, and I do not answer when, now and then, a voice that might be my own calls softly from the corner of the room, asking me to come and see. And in the darkness behind my eyelids, I see again a lantern hanging over a ravine, held steady in an unseen grasp, its flame untroubled by the wind, while something pale moves just beyond its circle of light and does not blink.